the forestry, agroforestry track. My name is Nick Schneider. I am the conservation planner for Mason CD. We're in Shelton, Washington. Do a lot of silvopasture and forestry stuff. So I joined the track with our forester, Margaret Prater, and Dylan, she from Organizing City and Safety. Right. So fun time, I'm gonna kick it off to our first speaker. We were really inspired last year by Road Meetings on that night's presentation, working with tribes. And so I know Spots and Island Tribe and the Indigenous Tribe are two of our biggest partners, if not our biggest partners in our community for exploitation. So wanted to kind of continue that theme this year. I'm gonna kick it off here. Yeah. Thanks. All right, still down through? Great. I think you said my name on. I've been with Washington State University Extension for 20 years now, primarily as a rangeland and livestock management specialist, working on the east side of the state, but probably statewide. And I want to say, given the title of the talk, I'm not an expert at all. I just read some stuff and I'm interested in pulling together some ideas. And I think there's some conclusions for land management. Does anyone know what the speakers are? So I can, coming out right there. And over there. Couldn't be. Thinking back. Well, we'll roll it and see what happens. This is not a slide heavy talk. There's not going to be a lot of graphs. It's mostly talking about ideas, and I'm hoping we have some time to just have some room discussion when I'm done. The other disclaimer I would add is that if there's anybody in here that is of Native American ancestry, and I say something that's offensive, understand that I don't know that it's offensive. I'm also following the lead of Charles Mann, who's an author who's written a lot about Indigenous management and the history of peoples in North, Central, and South America. And he explains at the beginning of the book why he uses the terms Indigenous peoples, Native Americans, First Nations, and Indians interchangeably, because they tend to refer to themselves by all of those names. And so I would like to use all of them, whether deliberately or just because that's what comes out of my mouth. Let's see if I can see this. I also want to mention that at various places throughout the talk, I'll mention some podcast episodes that are related to the topic that we're discussing at the moment. I've been doing a podcast since the end of 2018 called The Art of Range. And these are most of them 45-minute to 1-hour interviews on topics all over the place. And a lot of them touch on some of the things that we'll be visiting about today. So I may mention that if you've not listened to it, obviously I think it's worth listening to, but check it out. You can find it on iTunes, Stitcher, most of the non-advertising RSS feed podcasting platforms. Well, one of the big questions is that anybody who's in natural resources management has to ask is, what should we do? Is that our decision to make? Should it be natural or native vegetation or whatever term we want to use? Is it a built environment? Is it working land? Should we spend large amounts of money on restoring it to some believed species assemblage that might predate European settlement? How does anyone know what that was? Do we want wildlife populations or the absence of human influence? What if those two things don't match up? What does it mean to create set-aside lands that can go back to nature? What if that causes wildlife to decline? And is the exclusion of human manipulation of the environment virtuous in and of itself? And therefore, whatever we get out the other side of that is good. Those are not all of the questions that science can answer. So I want to talk about this for a little while, and hopefully we'll have some time to have an open conversation about it. I got into rangeland ecology out of a declared major in wildlife biology because I was interested in putting together the whole picture of the environment, because that's the real world. You can't just say, I'm going to do whatever is necessary to promote black bears or whatever, because in the real world, you have to accommodate people and other wildlife that have different habitat needs and cropland and recreational access and a whole host of things that cut into nearly every single decision that we make in terms of how to or whether or not to manipulate the natural environment. If our goal is to conserve some of these, what we call charismatic megafauna, or the important but lesser known microfauna, that requires working with people. I remember in a Natural Resources 101 class, the first year I was in college, the dean of the College of Ag, College of Forestry, Wildlife and Range at University of Idaho said, if you got into this, any one of these majors, because you expect to disappear into the wilds and not work with people, you're in the wrong place. If you want to cruise timber, that might be a place to get that done. But if you want to make a difference in the real world in affecting species conservation, plant conservation, landscape conservation, that's going to require working with people. And part of what attracted me to rangeland science is that it's by necessity a synthetic discipline. It's one that pulls together all the other fields of natural resource science to maintain whole ecosystems, including people. There does happen to be a relatively recent podcast episode on working across disciplines, episode number 106. Well, I work for a land-grant university, Washington State University, and many people hear the term land-grant college and may not know what it means. These are institutions of higher education that were initially funded by a grant of land, land given to the university by the state, either to be sold or otherwise profited by to fund at least the beginnings of a university. And the original mission specifically of these land-grant institutions, as it was set forth in the Morrill Act, which was signed by Abraham Lincoln in 1862, was to teach agriculture, military tactics, and the mechanic arts, as well as classical studies, so that members of the working classes could obtain a liberal and practical education. And so today it's become common practice for representatives of land-grant universities like me to offer a land acknowledgement to recognize that both the land the university is on and often the land that was sold to fund it 150 years ago was taken by force from Native Americans. And whether you're interested in being politically correct or not, it is healthy to know that history. And history is usually not pretty. If we go too far down the track of trying to apologize for my ancestors wronging your ancestors, we'll get pretty bogged down. My recent ancestors are German, Irish, English, Cherokee, and I don't know what all else. Most Americans don't have ethnically narrow lineages. So I'm a lot closer to Cherokee Indians than the distant European ancestors who may or may not have kept slaves somewhere in the American South. I really have no idea. People have been fighting and occupying and displacing and assimilating other people for all of human history, and we probably can't get to the bottom of it. However, the institutionalized, underhanded, forcible removal of Native Americans is worth mentioning and remembering and apologizing for. And the Europeans probably wouldn't have prevailed if it hadn't been for smallpox, but we'll talk about that later. What I think is of more interest is that Native Americans, and I know there's dangers in a naming convention, we're here for a long time and had a few things figured out. And I have tremendous respect for that, and I'm convinced that we can learn some things from what is a growing body of knowledge about Indigenous people's land management. What were their lifeways and their ways of knowing? How do they grow food? How do they understand land and animals and plants and humankind's relationship to them? Not only would learning about that be respectful, which is important, but my main point is that it might actually help us live in the present at a time when there are endless controversies over how to produce food, how not to destroy or permanently impair both local ecosystems and planetary scale ecosystem processes. But we had better get on it because that knowledge is fast disappearing from among Native American cultures. The Native American cultures and their wisdom recognize that they inhabit and are part of multi-scale ecosystems. And we still inhabit and are part of multi-scale ecosystems. And we have significant effects on those, even as we are currently flirting with disconnecting from nature through technology and automation, especially automated thinking, which we have tragically and incorrectly labeled artificial intelligence. These artifices may be able to run numerical and textual calculations in such a way that we're fooled into calling the output intelligence, but note well that we're the ones being fooled. Right now, there's fear that artificial intelligence may eventually acquire a mind of its own, but this is still not sentience or intelligence, it's just technology run amok. There's a really good book, one of my favorites, titled The Glass Cage, The Social Cost of Automation by Nicholas Carr. He makes the case that good technology enhances the uniquely human ability to understand and operate in the physical biological world. And bad technology or unhelpful uses of technology diminish that ability. He gives the intriguing example of Inuits in the Arctic who have 100 words for snow and have near extrasensory perception of the character of snow and ice. But they've begun to use GPS devices and snowmobiles to get around. And this has caused the loss of this intimate sense knowledge of snow and ice. Those skills are atrophying and disappearing. The result is a dramatic increase in fatal snowmobile accidents because the machines go over weak ice that never would have escaped the perception or the notice of an Inuit that still had those senses intact. But Nicholas Carr said, if we're not careful, this is a quote, the automation of mental labor by changing the nature and focus of intellectual endeavor may end up eroding one of the foundations of culture itself, our desire to understand the world. Predictive algorithms may be supernaturally skilled at discovering correlations, but they're indifferent to the underlying causes of traits and phenomena. Yet it's the deciphering of causation, the meticulous untangling of how and why things work the way they do, that extends the reach of human understanding and ultimately gives meaning to our search for knowledge. If we come to see automated calculations of probability as sufficient for our professional and social purposes, we risk losing or at least weakening our desire and motivation to seek explanations, to venture down the circuitous paths that lead toward wisdom and wonder. We badly need to venture down those circuitous paths, not just because it leads to discovery, which artificial intelligence really cannot do, but because it grounds us as humans in the limitations of the real physical biological world and causes us to pay attention to the world and to one another. Immersion in nature, like Native Americans live, creates a very different kind of relationship to a natural environment. I'm almost done philosophizing, we'll get into some more details. But I can't resist quoting from a philosophy professor named Esther Lightcap Meek in a book titled A Little Manual for Knowing. She says that we tend to think that knowledge is information, facts, bits of data, content, true statements justified by other true statements. And while this isn't exactly false, we have a vision of knowledge as being only this. We conclude that gaining knowledge is collecting information, and then we're done. Educated, trained, expert, certain. But this is a philosophical orientation, and it's an unexamined one. It has a lot of appeal because it is quantifiable, measurable, accessible, and commodifiable. It offers control and power, but the knowledge as information vision is actually defective and damaging. It distorts reality and humanness, and it gets in the way of good knowing. We should rather see knowing as a venture where the knower and the things known are like persons in relationship, where knowing is the relationship. To know properly and thoroughly, you have to give yourself, you the knower, to the known. And I submit that this is what Native Americans did with their environment, and evidence continues to mount that their interactions with their environments were far more sophisticated than we have naively and probably racistly assumed. Their subsistence was not hand-to-mouth opportunism, but involved large-scale manipulation of the world around them to both maintain natural processes and procure all the things needed for human civilization. We recognize that all of our basic human needs come from nature. Even today, in a world with all kinds of synthetic stuff, we can't live without food and water and shelter, the materials of which are all provided by functioning earth systems. And to state the obvious, all the synthetic stuff that we make is also synthesized from natural material that we get from the earth. So I'm aware that farmers and ranchers don't always see eye to eye. This is a bit of a different culture, even though once upon a time, most farmers grew both animals and crops. But to the person who has to make a living on a piece of land, this socioeconomic definition of rangelands, which could be applied to nearly any uncultivated land left today, which feels kind of cynical, makes pretty good sense. This is actually a definition that comes from Nathan Sayre's book, Politics of Scale, A History of Rangeland Science. He's a geographer at UC Berkeley, who's one of the better writers about rangeland science and the sociology of ranching that I've ever read. He says that these places that we call wild still have natural plant communities because they have not yet been monetized in some other way. And I think this is the critical part, these non-intensive agricultural systems are only profitable when they maintain or conserve healthy ecosystem functions. I think this is relevant because rangeland grazing is sort of a hybrid of wildlands and agricultural use. And it really represents one of the only methods of food and fiber production today that relies on naturally occurring plant communities and allows those ecosystems to produce a full range of ecosystem goods and services in that space. But that also makes it controversial. Jim Corbett, who was a pretty militant environmentalist who turned into a ranching advocate, said range and pasture-based livestock production is probably now the only livelihood that represents a true interdependence between man and wild biotic communities. To the environmental idealist, this represents a desecration of otherwise pure nature, and it's therefore an unforgivable sin. And getting some meat out of the deal doesn't redeem it. But to the agriculturist, on the other hand, it looks sort of like a loose, marginally profitable operation that's pretty sketchy as a business and too much work as a lifestyle. But I think ironically, this may actually be getting closer, and might be the closest thing, at least in our culture now, to how Native Americans viewed land. And I'm not including all versions of ranching in this comparison, but ranching done well does play to the strengths of the native ecosystem that it exists inside of. I want to mention something in passing here. There's a new major report just released from the Society for Range Management, put together by a group of scientists and ranchers who are working under the umbrella of the SRM, describing rangeland ecosystem services. There's been a couple of attempts at this. One that some people may be familiar with is the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that lays out some of all these ecosystem provisioning services and other things that we rely on whole ecosystems for. But the report, I think, importantly, acknowledges that humans are part of ecosystems at multiple scales, and we are both dependent on and exert significant influence on these ecosystems. And we are prone in a European-based culture to separate these things out into things that we associate with getting from farmland and the things that we think of being associated with natural lands or wild ones. But some of those distinctions are misleading or they're artificial. We do derive food and fiber from things that we consider wildlands, and certainly agricultural lands contribute to water and wildlife and some of these other features in various ways, not always positively, and that's what many of you are involved in trying to fix. But we also make the mistaken assumption, I think, that the best option everywhere is to just let nature take its course. And that was not the way of nearly all of the indigenous peoples around the world. We have inherited the idea that most of North America was a vast wilderness upon European arrival. And a growing amount of evidence suggests that that was very far from the truth. The quote on the screen, I think it shows that, almost. The quote on the screen says, "Only to the white man was nature a wilderness." That was Luther standing there. The quote is used by William Denovan in a 2011 paper titled "The Pristine Myth Revisited." He had authored in 1992 a paper called "The Pristine Myth," which was really controversial and made quite an impact. For a century or two, people have held the position that there were small, scattered groups of Native Americans, particularly in North America, but also in Central and South America. And he makes the case in The Pristine Myth, following his own anthropological research, primarily in Central America, that there were way more people here than we recognize. And that they had a significantly larger impact on the environment around them than we realized. And in this quote, Luther standing there didn't mean that white men felt uncomfortable in these untamed lands, but that they mistakenly believed that all this wide open space was not managed, not used, was idle, and was therefore available. The Indians actually used all of it for their needs and managed it accordingly. And I think there are a lot of deeply rooted ideas about how to manage land that are downstream from this wilderness ideal, this pristine myth, as William Denovan has described. And I think this comes from at least 4 major cultural phenomena. And this is partly my own musing, but integrating one of William Denovan's major assertions. I think the first major reason is that we have some of these distinctions that are based in European systems of property ownership and use, and as well as farming methods. I'll talk about that in a minute. I think the second reason is this erroneous belief that North America was all wilderness when Europeans arrived, and that that condition was natural. In other words, that was a condition that existed with all Native Americans present. The third major reason is that we have some pretty strong ideas about how vegetation changes through what's been called succession, that are based in climax theory, which was an idea put forward by a scientist out of Nebraska called Frederick Clements. And we'll discuss that briefly. And then fourthly, there is a legitimate cultural reaction to real harms that were caused by unsustainable management practices in North America, in both intensive and extensive agricultural systems, which mostly came from Europe. So first, this distinction. I think our differentiation between cultivated and uncultivated land, between farmland and wildland, would be completely foreign to most indigenous peoples. That dichotomy mostly comes from these European ideas about property and farming practices that usually involve annual monocultures grown one after the other, and a sedentary lifestyle. And I think we react to that idea by thinking, well, yeah, the Indians were hunters and gatherers. They lived in the wilds, but I think that too is a bit of a racist error, because the evidence continues to pile up that there were far more people in the Americas than we thought, that they had much more advanced food provisioning methods than we thought, that there was cross-continental trade that was much more prevalent and extensive than we thought, and that civilization was much more complex, organized, and extensive than we thought. There's a lot of evidence now that many indigenous peoples across the 3 continents lived in large cities. We may be importing our own ideas of what advanced civilization means, but when we say that, we usually associate advanced civilization with population centers, division of labor, organized agriculture, permaculture, aquaculture, well-established trade, methods of warfare, personal hygiene, systems of medicine, the list could go on. And all of those things were present across North and Central and South America in ways that we're only beginning to recognize. But it does point out what I think is sort of a mental spectrum of wild versus, intensive agro-ecosystems. I didn't have a good way to draw this out, but think for a moment, on one end of the spectrum, I don't know whether it should be left or right, my left or right, your left or right. But on one side, we've got, something that we think of as being totally wild. As far as we know, nobody's tested for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and it's just whatever nature provided on one end of this spectrum. And on the far other end of the spectrum, we might say that we have, conventional tillage agriculture that is invasive, that destroys soil aggregates. I apologize if I sound biased. I tend to gravitate toward the less intensive systems, but anybody who's in farming recognizes that there's some significant ecological problems with annual tillage. But then we have a whole lot that's in between. And if we've got the totally wild, native, never been touched over here on this end of the spectrum, probably coming in from that somewhere, we have what's been called extensive natural lands management, where we're retaining pretty much whatever the native species were, but we're exerting some influence to shape the composition of those plant communities in a way that provides for economically relevant plants. And I'm not talking about, modern culture right now, I'm talking about peoples across all time. If we come a little bit further on the spectrum, we could come to what might be called, more intensive natural lands management. In modern ranch systems, I see this. There are ranches that operate pretty much on ecosystems that we would say are in a reference state, that are essentially native to the best of our knowledge. And then there are those that are mostly working on diverse, naturalized, perennial populations of plants, where it may not be the stuff that was there 300 years ago, but it's sort of their functional equivalents. And we have all of the different plant functional groups represented, and there's some species diversity, but maybe it gets a herbicide application periodically to control a problem weed that came in with some hay, or it's periodically seeded to an introduced species. But it's still not crop farming. Then we move in the spectrum from that, and we might have, say, what we would call tame pastures, where the whole thing is introduced species that were planted at some point and that we're managing pretty specifically for livestock production, where that wouldn't be the case back over here a little further down the spectrum. On a more native ecosystem that's being grazed, the goal is not necessarily maximum stocking rate, but maintaining ecosystem processes and harvesting just enough so that you're not materially or substantively changing that plant community. So let's see, we've got completely wild, what I'm calling extensive natural lands management, a little bit more intensive natural lands management, tame pasture systems, and then we start to move back over toward a little bit more of a built environment, but still pretty fuzzy in the middle. So maybe the next thing on the spectrum is what are sometimes called polyculture food systems, and this was well practiced by a lot of people, indigenous peoples on the East Coast, in Central America, and all over South America, where it was not a monoculture. It might look a lot like a forest with an understory, but those plants were food plants. We would call that a polyculture food system. And then a little bit further out, we might have crop rotation, where you've got some perennials and periodically rotate with a cover crop that is intended to provide a shot of organic matter and nitrogen. And then if we get all the way out to the other end of the spectrum, that's what I'm calling conventional tillage agriculture. Serial meaning one after the other monoculture. Well, the dominant example of this, and I'm saying that most indigenous peoples operated somewhere in this middle range and didn't have this sharp distinction between heavily farmed and then nobody's ever touching it. And of course, the dominant example of expensive natural lands management in North America, at least, is large-scale burning that removed standing dead material. It suppressed the dominance of large-statured perennial grasses and woody species. It kept the herbaceous canopy open enough to allow a large number of annual and perennial forbs and short grasses. And all of these things have benefits to different wildlife species and humans, both nutritionally and medicinally. And I'll mention here that I think one of my favorite podcast episodes so far was the interview with Fred Provenza. For those that know the name, Fred's a fascinating guy, but he was an animal behaviorist at Utah State for many, many years. And did a ton of research showing that when animals have the choice of a large number of species in their potential diet selection, they eat small amounts of nearly everything out there, and that those plants provide some significant pharmaceutical benefits to the animals. And in fact, I could name you several conventional ranchers who will say that the animals that are there, they're animals that are grazing on native rangelands that have maybe 50 or 60 species in a 10 by 30 meter species richness plot, have almost no doctor costs. The animals go in healthy, stay healthy, and come out healthier than the animals that are on irrigated pasture with 4 or 5 species, which looks really lush, but there's a pretty narrow diet selection there. So listen to episode number 4 with Fred Provenza on plant secondary compounds and forage sequencing. Well, because I'm not an expert on all the specific practices of Native Americans, I'm going to read a passage here from Charles Mann's book, 1491, A History of the Americans Before Columbus. And if you've not heard of it or read it, I highly recommend getting the book and reading it. It probably is a book that has blown my mind, to use an overused term, more than anything else I've read in the last 20 years. Well, he wrote the book in response to archaeological and geographic and anthropological research findings that he dug up in writing his other book, a previous book, 1493, which was about, the subtitle of that book is Uncovering the World Columbus Created. And in the writing of 1493, he found overwhelming evidence that I keep alluding to, of much larger populations of the Americas than previously thought. And a lot of the shift in thinking among the anthropologists, anyway, is based in these discoveries about food systems. In fact, the anthropologists had limited estimated population counts based on assumptions about the food systems people had access to. It wasn't based necessarily in primary evidence of habitations or bones or whatever. They were making circular assumptions based on what we thought we knew about what was possible in their food systems. This has more to do with the practice of burning, but I think it's worth taking the time to read it. Early in the last century, ecologists discovered the phenomenon of succession, the more or less well-defined sequence by which ecosystems fill in open land. A textbook example occurred after the eruption in 1980 of Mount St. Helens in southern Washington state, which inundated more than 200 square miles with magma, volcanic ash, and mud. Surviving plants sprang quickly to life, sometimes resprouting within weeks. Then colonizing species like lupin appeared, preparing the ground for the return of the grasses. For those who have not visited, it's been a long time since I was there, but when I was there, you know, what you're standing on is about, in some places, 60 to 100 feet of the pulverized inside of the volcano that got belched out on the ground. You know, so this is what ecologists call primary succession, meaning you've got nothing but bare parent material. There's nothing else there. There's no soil development, there's no microorganisms, there's no fungi, there's no soil aggregates, there's no leftover rootstock, there's no seeds, there's no nothing. And what does it look like for a plant community to establish in that kind of seemingly totally sterile environment? It was fascinating. 15 years after the eruption, the ravaged slopes were dotted with trees and woody shrubs. Red alder, lodgepole pine, willow bush. Here and there gleamed the waxy red boles of madrona. Forest giants like hemlock, Douglas fir, and Sitka spruce waited in the wings. In the classic successional forest, each suite of plants replaces its predecessor until the arrival of the final climax ecosystem, usually tall forest. If ecological succession were unstoppable, the continents would be covered by climax stage vegetation, a world of great trees, dark and silent. Early succession species would have vanished. Luckily for these species, succession is often interrupted. Nature does not move in lockstep. Windstorms, lightning fires, landslides, volcanic eruptions, and other natural calamities knock down trees and open up the forest, or prevent open country from turning into forest land. A few years or decades of tranquility may see grasses replaced by shrubs and trees, which are in turn flattened by a violent thunderstorm, permitting the grass to thrive again. After a while, the shrubs and trees return only to be wiped out by a flood, and so on. Different types of disturbance shape different ecosystems. Floods in the Nile, landslides on the steep pitches of the Andes, hurricanes in the Yucatan Peninsula. For more than 10,000 years, most North American ecosystems have been dominated by fire. In the Greek myth of Prometheus, the gift of fire forever severs humanity from the natural world. The burning torch is the icon of the constructed and artificial. On the mundane, factual level, though, this resonant tale is wrong. Nature has always used fire as a mallet to beat landscapes into other forms. Prometheus only helped human beings to pick up the handle. The earth, wrote the pioneering fire ecologist Edward Comeric, born in fire, baptized by lightning, since before life's beginning has been and is a fire planet. Set off by lightning, wildfires reset the ecological clock, dialing the array of plants and animals back a few successional stages. Fire benefits plants that need sunlight, while inhibiting those that love the cool gloaming of the forest floor. It encourages the animals that need those plants, even as it discourages others. In turn, predator populations rise and fall. In this way, fire regulates ecological character. Fire is a dominating factor in many, if not most, terrestrial landscapes. It has two main sources: lightning and Homo sapiens. In North America, lightning fire is most common in the Western mountains. Elsewhere, though, Indians controlled it, at least until European contact, and in many places long after. In the Northeast, Indians always carried a deerskin pouch full of flints, Thomas Morton reported in 1637, which they used to, quote, set fire of the country in all places where they come. The flints also ignited torches, which were as important to the hunt as bows and arrows. Deer in the Northeast, alligators in the Everglades, buffalo in the prairies, grasshoppers in the Great Basin, rabbits in California, moose in Alaska, all were pursued by fire. Native Americans made big rings of flame, Thomas Jefferson wrote, by firing the leaves falling on the ground, which gradually forcing animals to the center. There they slaughtered them with arrows, darts, and other missiles. Not that Indians always used fire for strictly utilitarian purposes. At nightfall, tribes in the Rocky Mountains entertained the explorers Meriwether Lewis and William Clark by applying torches to sap-dripping fir trees, which then exploded like Roman candles. Rather than domesticate animals for meat, Indians retooled ecosystems to encourage elk, deer, and bear. Constant burning of undergrowth increased the numbers of herbivores, the predators that fed on them, and the people who ate them both. Rather than the thick, unbroken, monumental snarl of trees imagined by Thoreau, the great eastern forest was an ecological kaleidoscope of garden plots, blackberry rambles, pine barrens, and spacious groves of chestnut, hickory, and oak. The first white settlers in Ohio found woodland that resembled English parks. They could drive carriages through the trees. 15 miles from shore in Rhode Island, Giovanni de Verrazano found trees so widely spaced that the forest could be penetrated even by a large army. John Smith claimed to have ridden through the Virginia forest at gallop. It is incredible to imagine today, but bison roamed from New York to Georgia. A creature of the prairie, bison, was imported to the east by Native Americans along a path of indigenous fire as they changed enough forest into fallows for it to survive far outside its original range. When the but I can pronounce all these words. Haudenosaunee hunted these animals, the historian William Cronin observed, they were harvesting a foodstuff which they had consciously been instrumental in creating. Few English observers could have realized this. People accustomed to keeping domesticated animals lacked the conceptual tools to recognize that the Indians were practicing a more distant kind of husbandry of their own. Indian fire had its greatest impact in the middle of the continent, which Native Americans transformed into a prodigious game farm. Native Americans burned the Great Plains and Midwest prairies so much and so often that they increased their extent. In all probability, a substantial portion of the giant grasslands celebrated by cowboys was established and maintained by the people who arrived there first. When Lewis and Clark headed west from St. Louis, wrote ethologist Dale Watt, they were exploring not a wilderness, but a vast pasture managed by and for Native Americans. In 1792, the surveyor Pete Fiddler examined the plains of southern Alberta systematically, the first European to do so. Riding with several groups of Indians in high fire season, he spent days on end in scorched land. Grass all burnt this day, he reported on November 12th. Not a single pine to be seen 3 days past. A day later, all burnt ground this day. A day later, the grass nearly burnt all along this day except near the lake. A month later, the grass is now burning with very great fury. Quote, every fall and spring, and even in the winter when there is no snow, these large plains, either in one place or other, is constantly on fire. And when the grass happens to be long and the wind is high, the sight is grand and awful, and it drives along with amazing swiftness. Fiddler acknowledged that the fires could be very dangerous, but understood their purpose. These fires burning off the old grass, he observed, in the ensuing spring and summer makes excellent fine sweet feed for the horses and buffalo, etc. When Indian societies disintegrated from disease and mistreatment, forest invaded savanna in Wisconsin, Illinois, Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, and the Texas Hill Country. Europeans forgot what the landscape had looked like before and why. Captain John Palliser, traveling through the same lands as Fiddler 6 decades later, lamented the Indians' quote, disastrous habit of setting the prairie on fire for the most trivial and worse than useless reasons. Afterward, even the memory of indigenous fire faded. By the 20th century, biologists were stoutly denying its existence. The open park-like woods seen by early settlers, Harvard naturalist Hugh Raup asserted in 1937, were not caused by fire. They have been from time immemorial, characteristic of vast areas of North America. Raup's summary description of the idea that they were due to regular wide-scale Indian burning, he said it was inconceivable. It is at least a fair assumption. A widely used college forestry textbook remarked in 1973 that no habitual or systematic burning was carried out by Indians. In the Western United States, the geographer Thomas Vail wrote in 2002, the modest Indian population modified only a tiny fraction of the total landscape for their everyday living needs. Well, that opinion is in the minority now. Spurred in part by historians like Cronin, most scientists have changed their minds about Indian fire. Using clever laboratory techniques, they have convinced themselves that in most cases, the tribal lore and the old chronicles were right all along. Indian embers were sparkling in the American night for centuries before the Sumerians climbed their ziggurats in the other hemisphere. Carrying their flints and torches, Native Americans were living in balance with nature, but they had their thumbs on the scale. Faked for their comfort and convenience, the American landscape had come to fit their lives like comfortable clothing. It was a highly successful and stable system, if stable is the appropriate word for a regime that involves routinely enshrouding miles of countryside in smoke and ash. And it was a system that Indians were abandoning in ever-rising numbers at the time when Europeans came. Again, this 1491 is an amazing, fascinating account of what's now a growing body of evidence about the size of and practice of Native American culture. Evening. But as he just briefly alluded to in there, much of the American wilderness ideal exists because the continent that Europeans settled in had been depopulated, decimated. I mean, actually decimated in the mathematical sense of the word. Decimation means that a tenth is left over. In many cases, it was less than a tenth of the previous human population was left. 90% of the people in most of North and Central and South America were wiped out largely by smallpox. That in many cases preceded the Europeans into the continent, because smallpox was being carried by pigs that were moving, wild pigs that were moving in ahead of the Europeans. William Denham, the guy who wrote this article, The Pristine Myth, wrote an article more recently titled Nature Rebounds, describing this vegetation response. North America was not untouched by humans, but it had been a while. So in this book, in 1491, using William Denham as one of his primary sources, Charles Mann makes a pretty good case that in the 1400s, the population of North America was probably significantly larger than that of Europe, and Europe was in its heyday in the 1400s. By virtue of sophisticated social structures, trade practices, political alliances, food systems, but these fields had been growing untended for a century or two before European explorers and naturalists like Thoreau described the vegetation, which appeared to them as wilderness. So the Europeans encountered a continent that was on the rebound, and they absorbed this idea of nature untrammeled by man. And now that concept is associated with new versions of virtue. We pretty much worship or idolize the intrinsic good of untouched land. I read all of Leopold. I grew up in wildlife biology, almost a double major in forestry. I like wild places. That pulls on me too. But so does integrating humans into these natural processes, which is what indigenous peoples have been doing all over the globe up until a century ago or two. Well, the third thing that I mentioned that has affected our idea about wilderness and human use and our proper relationship to the land is this idea from Frederick Clemens about climax plant communities. Again, this is the supposedly predictable sequence of plant communities and species composition that occupies land either in primary succession after something like a volcano blows, or in secondary succession after fire or flood, buries vegetation. But his idea was that if you removed human disturbances from the landscape, that those plant communities would move inexorably toward whatever this single climax state was. We have since learned that while that was sort of the case on the edge of the tall grass prairie and the deciduous forest, because in the absence of fire, you would have the encroachment of trees and then fire would knock it back. That concept or that theory never did really work in the semi-arid and arid ecosystems of most of the American West. This is not that talk, but we now recognize that there's more of a non-linear or a non-equilibrium successional multiple pathways that are possible and multiple endpoints that are possible in response to various disturbances in most semi-arid plant communities. And the idea that you can just remove a human influence and it will automatically, eventually, end up in some, pre-Columbus ecological nirvana has largely been discredited, even though that's sort of the assumption that many of us carry to ideas about land management. The fourth major influence, I think, was the very real damages that were caused by unsustainable management principles and practices that we imported from Europe. That's not to say that those management ideas were unsustainable in the ecosystems that they came from, because what I'm familiar with is livestock management, but many people may have heard the adage that a grass plant's goal in life is to produce a seed head, and the cow man's goal is to prevent it from doing that. Well, that works in a rhizomatous or a sod forming plant community where the plants are stimulated by frequent defoliation. That defoliation pattern causes them, it stimulates asexual reproduction. Stimulation, the removal of that apical meristem causes the plant to tiller out and fill in bare spaces and reproduce. But most of the West has plants that have elevated growing points that rely on seed production for reproduction. And so that frequency of defoliation prevented the plants from reproducing, and we end up with the most dominant plants in the community falling out of the species composition because they never get a chance to reproduce. If we follow that grazing adage, we have new ideas now, but because the climax theory didn't work, and you couldn't just remove that grazing pressure and then get back what you had before. You know, we've now in plant communities like this, we've moved across an ecological threshold into a new stable state, but one that's degraded and is missing the pieces that would be necessary for it to come back. I suspect, although farming is not my bailiwick, that some of the ideas about monoculture cropping that also came from Europe probably did work in ecosystems where they were, you know, farming in floodplains and coastal marshes that were regularly inundated and had regular infusions of new organic matter and sediment and nitrogen that would have been sustainable, but it didn't work in quite a bit of North America. But this wilderness ideal, the preservationist paradigm, sort of dead ends in circular reasoning that's almost like a means-based management framework. So we put a moral stamp on our methods. We say that if we don't touch anything, then whatever comes out the other end of that must be good, because it's natural. And what's natural is good, so we shouldn't touch it. An alternative might be what I think is actually a current shift toward sort of outcomes-oriented management, where we apply this management practice because it's going to push this ecological process toward Y result, and that's what we want. But we also import these biases into our interpretation of data, of making meaning out of bare facts. I saw recently a pretty interesting research paper titled "Reintroducing Bison Results in Long-Running and Resilient Increases in Grassland Diversity." It's accurate, but as I'm reading the paper, the conditions that are being described in response to bison grazing are what I would have considered severe overgrazing. Like if I was advising a rancher on land that had these characteristics, I would say that's a little bit too much, you gotta get off on it. But the effect was that it was maintaining a fairly early cereal stage that had a wide diversity of some of these minor forms that you don't see when the area has more rest and is taken over by some of the more dominant plants. So if the same conditions had been described in an area that had cattle on them, it would be described as overgrazing, water pollution, compacted soils, denudation of the plant community, etc. So we muddle things. Let's see. Yeah, we're well familiar with the risks in some of the older versions of crop farming. In fact, the Palouse, which is the area around where I and probably some of you went to school in Poland and Moscow, was in the soil textbooks back in the day as being the place that had the highest rate of soil erosion ever measured by scientific methods in the modern era. They were losing sometimes feet of soil per year in response to soil erosion, that in response to back-to-back wheat cropping. But older ideas about how to handle nature, which we might call stewardship, had more the idea of bringing forth the nature of a thing rather than this modernist impulse to move to extremes, to either modify nature extensively to bend it to our purposes or by removing human inputs altogether. We have this post-industrial, post-enlightenment mindset that nature is just raw material waiting for me to shape it to my purposes. And here again, I think we really see a blending of those two extremes in Native Americans' philosophies for land use. A grassland would remain a grassland, would retain the character of a grassland, but the character and the qualities of the grasses that are growing there would be shaped through human influence. You know, we planted wheat in places that should never have had wheat planted, largely because of bad economic incentives. And then when we discovered that wheat isn't sustainable, we plant it back with a single introduced grass species where there previously were 60 different species. Then it takes 100 years for us to get back to an ecosystem that has most of the plant functional groups in it. So this tension between the extremes is happening in flashing neon lights right now in land management battles. But it's pretty important to remember that not doing anything, capital N, capital D, capital A, is a really strong management choice. It's a decision that has pretty potent effects. Anybody tell me what time it is?
4:30.
Got it. I'm gonna move on a little bit. To have a discussion about wetlands, which I think is one of our blind spots. I did an interview with Charles Mann, the author of the book. I think those are episodes 95 and 96. It's really interesting. He's a fascinating character, and he's a really good writer. Since I read his book, I picked up another book on Indigenous land management, thinking that I would read it in preparation for this talk. And I began reading it and realized, wow, this guy is an awful writer. There were no specifics. Like I read dozens of pages of abstract and terrible prose, and I gave it up. So I went back to, reread some of Charles Mann. Anyway, he's an excellent writer, and he's a good speaker. This was an interesting interview. I also want to mention, for those that are more interested in cropping and conservation of, more agricultural soil as opposed to rangelands and wildlands, that there's a lot of information in this book about the polyculture practices in Central America and South America. He talks quite a bit about terra preta, this charcoal-like substance that everybody's heard about at this point, to maintain fertility in tropical soils that would ordinarily just burn up organic matter, and it wouldn't stay fertile for very long. This problem of subtropical and tropical soils was largely what caused anthropologists to put a cap on the believed populations in Central and South America. And he has a long discussion about some of the farming methods and polyculture and fertilizer practices of the Indians on the East Coast, including a really cool retelling of the Pilgrim story that does justice to the Indians that were there, and kind of makes fun of the white men that seem to have no hygiene, and they couldn't hit anything with their rifles, and the Indians could, they could hit something at 300 yards with an arrow, and they were way more potent than the rifles. There's all kinds of stuff there. All right. I think one of our blind spots is in some of the more productive environments, including wetlands. I don't know if I can go back. I just hit a
Yeah, I can
right
go.
button. It didn't go back. This is a fence line contrast over southwest of Moses Lake on a section of ground that is called the Magnuson Bird Ground. It's called that because Warren Magnuson, who was one of the longest running senators in Washington State, bought it and managed it as a place to hunt game birds back 50 years ago. The areas around it have since been taken over by Russian olive and Phragmites australis, which is giant green. But the Bureau of Reclamation manages this whole area for migratory waterfowl. But migratory waterfowl, which are sometimes called shorebirds, require shore line and open water for them to be around. So I discovered this a few years ago in working with Eric Williamson, who's one of a big farmer in the area, who also grazes some of this. And he took me out to take a look at this section in the middle of the Bureau of Reclamation's wasteway, Frenchman Hills Wasteway. And on one side of the fence, you've got Russian olive that's 30, 40 feet tall. It's nearly impenetrable. I mean, you can't walk through it. And any place where there's not Russian olive, there's a little bit more soil moisture. There's cattails and Phragmites. And so on the inside of the property down in the Magnuson Bird Ranch, they cut down the Russian olive periodically. It's not native. It was originally planted in some of the places because the seeds from Russian olive are pretty beneficial. They produce a lot of stuff that birds can eat. But when it takes off, it takes over the world. And they graze it. And as a range person, I feel like I think I just lost my mind.
Yeah.
They graze the far out of it. I think I can tell.
Okay.
But interestingly, I've lived in Washington State, lived in the Northwest since 1995. And when I stepped onto this place, we went through the gate, like you're going through it feels like an arbor of Russian olive. And you come out this tunnel, like coming out of a railway tunnel. And all of a sudden, there's more sand-filled cranes than I've ever seen in my life in one view. And the sound was deafening. There were Canada geese, there were pelicans, and I've got a picture of it in a minute. But the bird population was unbelievable. And they were all in this area that's, more active. It's actually kind of a seasonal wetland that's being managed for the birds. And I think this points up my purpose in that. Let's talk about grazing on wetlands, but people have historically used fire on wetlands for that purpose. Without some disturbance, the amount of plant growth that's possible in a wetland, it grows out of control, where you end up with gigantic amounts of dead plant material that actually choke out the stuff underneath it, and eventually, even in terms of water quality, become a source of nutrients and bacteria instead of being a sink for nutrients and bacteria. Rather than a filter, it's now exporting stuff because it's become decadent and you don't have as much active plant growth. So this, I don't know whether this shows up with the lights. Whether or not we can kind of the light. This is, I don't know how well this shows up. This is actually the fence line in Google Earth. I probably should have taken the white line out because you don't even need the lines to fence line contrast. But these are sort of potable wetlands, semi-wetlands, seasonal wetlands, and that photograph of the birds was taken from right here, and the birds are all in here. But if you can see this contrast, the canopy cover of the Russian olive down here is probably 60 to 70%. And where there's not Russian olive, there's the Phragmites. And the result, partly of the Phragmites, isn't just that you've got more vegetation structure sitting on top of the open water. It removes the open water because these colonizer wetland grasses like giant reed actually terrestrialize the area. They catch sediment and they begin to build out and march in from the water's edge, where you end up with less and less open water. I think I've got a before and after sequence too. This is the north-south fence line just around the corner from that, where you can see the terrestrialization of this wetland marching in on the edges. The vegetation in that marsh wetland is natural, It's inland salt grass, the Tipton spicata. Some other natives, cattail. But yeah, so here's the area when in 2006, when the Russian olive were taken over. Here's the same shot in 2017, after mechanical removal of the Russian olive, and you've actually begun to have some coming back. But the combination of mechanical control of the woody species and what is, pretty heavy grazing maintains the plant community that is preferable to these birds. They literally vote with their feet for their wings. Now that I know we're short on time, there are downsides, and I'm not discounting the downsides of aggressive grazing on a wetland. In that scenario, it works, probably because you've got pretty sandy soils that are remarkably durable. And so you can have quite a bit of livestock traffic that are eating the inland salt grass, and it doesn't have a negative effect. There are places where you get heavy grazing on finer textured soils that are deep, and you get some problems. But the point is, we don't have to go to the extremes of saying the way to solve all the problems is to remove all human management. We need to think about what we're doing and apply management that works for the things that we want. And that sounds sort of human centric, but the fact remains that pretty much all of those choices are being made by us, whether we want to acknowledge it or not. Because the decision to do nothing also has effects. There are also some water quality conflicts. You go back to the slide with the bird again. There's one of them. There can be some water quality conflicts in these places, but not primarily from livestock. For those who are from Kittitas County, we had some significant sedimentation problems coming off of flood irrigated fields, because the practice of corrugating the fields to control water distribution had the effect of running a lot of dirt off the end of the field into streams. And it was a problem. So we built settling ponds to hold that sediment and let the sediment settle out of suspension, and then let the clear water flow out. The problem with that was that those settling ponds attracted birds, and the birds all poop in the water, and you've got sky high fecal coliform loads coming out of the ponds that help birds. So we cleaned up the sediment problem, and now we've got a bacteria problem. Okay, a couple of general principles here. The Native Americans had discovered or recognized that disturbance is an extremely important component of maintaining species richness. Spatial heterogeneity, meaning that we've got a mosaic of different kinds of plant communities in different stages all over the place. And ecosystem function in wetland environments and upland environments. For those that haven't read anything by Sam Fuhlendorf, he's a fire researcher out of Oklahoma that's done a lot of work on heterogeneity. And I've got a list of a couple of really good papers that if anybody wants, they can come take a picture of the bibliography when we're done here. They also recognize that grazing and fire maintained vegetation structure that was advantageous to the species that they wanted, wildlife species that they wanted. And we recognize that some of these larger dominant grass species can take over. And when that happens, it tends to reduce biodiversity by quite a lot. It's the grassland version of an old growth forest. When I was at the University of Idaho, they had a fire and water symposium. And there was some really interesting stuff from British Columbia describing the conditions in old growth western red cedar, where there had been no disturbance like fire for more than 600 years. And what you had there was pretty much nothing but western red cedar. And not a whole lot of wildlife, except a few things that nest in the western red cedar. The streams that run through the areas that are this old growth red cedar don't have anything in them, because there's no deciduous canopy on the stream to provide the allochthonous organic matter that provides food microinvertebrates and macroinvertebrates that feed the fish. And it sort of is a downward spiral where the ecosystem sort of contracts on itself. We need places that have old growth Western red cedar. But if all of the places that could grow Western red cedar were only 700-year-old monoculture Western red cedar, then we have a lot of species that aren't going to live there. The same thing happens in grasslands. I bumped past it, but one of the slides showed large bunch grasses with wide areas of bare dirt between them. That tends to be what you get in this part of the world if there's no fire and no grazing or no insect herbivory on those the tallest, most dominant perennial grasses in the system. All right, you see. Can you go backwards? One thing here, I wanted to mention this. Yeah, I think we can avoid the extremes. The no disturbance extreme is often destructive and antagonistic to rangeland health, wetland health, riparian health, forest health. But the attitude of take it all and we'll log the other plants later is also destructive. And that leads to species composition shifts that are undesirable and the loss of the animal communities that we associate with those plants. So it's no secret that I'm an advocate for well-managed rangeland livestock grazing, because I think that if we can grow food and fiber in places where we're not compromising the integrity of naturally occurring rangeland ecosystems, that's something that we can do and should do. And I think it's a blending of this intensive and extensive agriculture that involves modifying our methods to match nature. This is one of the concepts in the Fred Provenza interview. We have tended in the past to try to homogenize the environment to make it good for the single purpose that we're trying to deal with it for. And Provenza is an advocate for modifying our methods to match nature. And in my world, that means selecting breeds, selecting within breed genetics, selecting grazing methods and animal husbandry practices that match the environment, that allow the character of that ecosystem to be expressed. And in fact, that kind of livestock grazing is most profitable when it's most ecologically sustainable. So there was a recent effort to put together some overarching grazing principles from 100 years of literature and from some listening sessions at the Society for Range Management 2023 annual meeting in Boise back in February. And these are about to be published, but are not published yet. But it's the result of a symposium that was a public event. So number one is a practice adaptive management, meaning that we modify what we're doing when we see that it's not either protecting ecosystem health or not protecting animal health. We optimize the stalking rate. This is still one of the primary variables that we can manipulate. Barry Perryman, who's currently the president of the Society for Range Management, is fond of saying that grazing is not a noun, it's a verb. And there's a whole host of variables that we can manipulate to create very different effects from grazing. We have to think about what that is. We can manipulate the timing relative to the phenological stage of each of the different plants that are out there. It has a different effect at different times of the year. We can manipulate or adjust the intensity of grazing. We can change the frequency of these defoliation events, the duration of the defoliation event. We can identify specific ecological goals that might be important in a particular area and manage livestock in a way that hit those specific goals, whether it's reducing the risk of wildfire or promoting an understory that has a lot of wildflowers in it. Number four, we have to prioritize ecological health, because pretty much everything, including the profitability of livestock operations, is downstream from prioritizing ecological health, including maintaining heterogeneity, which is a lot of what Sam Fuhlendorf has talked about, and supporting biodiversity. To do that, we have to think through animal distribution. If you had 20 range scientists in the room, every single one of them would say almost all the problems that we associate with livestock grazing have to do with animal distribution, not with stocking rate, even though stocking rate can make a difference. We have to keep in mind that animal welfare begets performance. So if we're in the business of trying to make a living in the natural environment, that's dependent on animal welfare, which is also tied to the ecological health of the land. And the final factor is we've got to think beyond the range. We've got to integrate some of these external factors into planning and management, think about the context of the place, and think about some of the broader benefits of successful grazing. So I think we should and are in a position now to better understand some consideration of how Native Americans manage land for a variety of purposes, and recognize that probably they were managing all of it. We should recognize that humans are part of this macro ecosystem, and that provisioning for human needs from wildland ecosystems is a legitimate expectation. I think we should challenge the idea of set aside land that is expected to be pure because humans aren't there. We can't avoid affecting whatever is out there. And I think that we have some regulatory frameworks and restrictions that might be at odds with ecosystem function. We see some of those antagonisms, especially in the world of bird conservation. And the folks at Ducks Unlimited and Pheasants Forever and some of these species-specific conservation groups can talk about that in space. And I think we should avoid arguing from extremes and move beyond reactionary ideas about whether human involvement is good or bad. And we should enter into this knowing venture to understand the ecological wisdom of the people who were doing sustainable and regenerative agriculture long before it was sexy. They had a few things figured out. Can you go back to the slide?
Yeah.
I can't resist putting up the slide of this bear, because the bear is in an area where we've been managing according to what I think are good livestock management principles for about 15 years. And the result of that on an area of about 30,000 acres is pretty impressive wildlife diversity. I actually caught the photograph of this guy turning because I was doing some field work and I'm on my hands and knees, frantically scribbling on a clipboard. And I stand up to straighten my back and turn around, and here's this bear. I'm not kidding, from here to the end of the room. And he's up on his hind legs, just looking at me like this. And it took me a while to figure out what I was looking at. My first thought was, dang, that's a big dog. And then he turned around and started to go back on all fours, and that was when I snapped the shot. But I ended up seeing the same bear about 3 times in the same year and haven't seen him since. But it looked like it was probably a yearling cinnamon-faced black bear that was in the area. And interestingly, once he turned around and went down, I didn't see him move but about 15 feet. And I was in that same spot for about the next 2 hours, and I have no idea where he went. I never heard him, never saw him. I didn't see bushes rustling, but the shrub cover is only about 5 feet tall. And so you would think that if he was there, he'd be visible. All right, check out the Art of Range if you haven't before. And I just scanned through the list of titles. I think there'll be some stuff that's interesting. And I've got time for questions, even though I know we totally ran out the program schedule. Yeah, question? No, okay. We're bidding on the bear. All right, thank you.